The wind howled through the ruins of the dead planet, carrying with it the scent of rust, burnt metal, and something far worse, decay. Jared adjusted his mask, the cracked visor doing little to shield his face from the biting dust that scraped against his skin like tiny razors. He had been scavenging for hours, searching through the wreckage of old ships, hoping to find something valuable. Ammo, rations, maybe even a working power cell. But so far, nothing but junk. His boots crunched over shattered glass and twisted metal as he made his way toward a new wreckage site. Unlike the others, this one looked fresh. Smoke still curled up from the wreck, glowing faintly in the twilight. The ship had been small, maybe an escape pod, but the damage was severe. Its hull was cracked open like an egg, exposing the dark interior. Jared's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. There were too many dangers on this planet. Raiders, hostile creatures, even the ground itself wasn't always stable. But something about the wreck felt different. He stepped forward, pulse quickening as he peered inside. At first, he saw nothing but debris. Torn seats, flickering emergency lights, the charred remains of a control panel. Then movement. A figure was curled up in the shadows, clutching something close to their chest. Jared tensed, hand resting on the grip of his rifle. He could barely make out the shape, a slender, hunched form, wrapped in ragged fabric. Then he saw the eyes. Large, dark, and filled with fear. Jared inhaled sharply. It was an alien. A woman, her skin a strange shade of deep blue, marred with bruises and dirt. Her breathing was ragged, uneven. She clutched something desperately to her chest, and it took him a second to realize what it was. A child. Jared froze. He had seen aliens before, mostly on battlefields, mostly as enemies. But this was different. The child was so small, wrapped tightly in a tattered blanket, its tiny face barely visible beneath the folds. The mother's arms tightened protectively around the child as she pressed herself against the wreckage, watching him with pure terror. Jared took a slow step forward, lifting his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "Hey," he said, voice low, steady. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The woman flinched, shrinking back even further. She didn't understand him. Of course she didn't, but she understood his presence, his weapon, the danger of a human standing in front of her while she was weak and helpless. Jared's gaze flicked to the child. It wasn't moving. His stomach tightened. Were they starving? Dying? The wreckage didn't show any supplies, and judging by the state of the mother, she hadn't eaten in days. Maybe longer. Jared reached for his pack, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle her. He pulled out a ration bar, unwrapped it halfway, and held it out. The smell of food hit the air. The woman's breath hitched, her gaze flickering between him and the bar. For a long, agonizing moment, she didn't move. Then, so fast it was almost a blur, she snatched it from his hand and tore into it, breaking off a piece and pressing it to the child's lips. The little one stirred, barely, mouth opening just enough to accept the food. Relief flickered across the woman's face, though it didn't last. She looked up at Jared again, wary, ready to fight if needed. Jared exhaled. "You need more than that," he muttered, reaching into his pack again. Then, behind him, something growled. The sound was low, guttural, vibrating through the air like a warning. Jared's entire body tensed as he turned his head slightly, just enough to see movement in the distance. Something was watching them. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew one thing. This planet didn't have friendly wildlife. If it had followed him here, it had caught the scent of prey. Jared clenched his jaw, gripping his rifle. He had come here looking for scrap. Instead, he had found a starving mother and child. And now, something was hunting them all. Jared's grip tightened around his rifle as the growl echoed through the ruins. It wasn't just the sound itself that sent a chill down his spine. It was the weight behind it, the deep resonance of something massive, something predatory. He knew that sound. He had heard it before, on another world, in another battle. It was the sound of something that had already decided they were prey. The alien mother tensed, her large, dark eyes flicking toward the darkness outside the wrecked pod. She clutched her child closer, her entire body shaking, but she made no noise. She knew the rules of survival. Stay silent. Stay still. Don't attract attention. But it was already too late. Jared moved slowly, keeping his eyes on the shifting shadows beyond the wreck. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the dimly lit terrain, searching for movement. The wind howled again, kicking up dust and debris. But there, just for a second, he saw it. A hulking shape, low to the ground, with limbs that moved too smoothly, too deliberately. It was stalking them. He turned back to the alien woman, speaking in a low whisper. "We have to move." She didn't understand his words, but she didn't need to. She could see it in his eyes. The threat, the urgency. She hesitated, her arms still wrapped protectively around the child. Jared's frustration spiked. Did she not trust him? Did she think she had a choice? He clenched his jaw. There was no time for this. He reached into his pack and pulled out a canteen, holding it up so she could see. Water, food, safety. He pointed away from the wreck, toward the distant structures he had seen on his way here. They were barely more than ruins, but there was a chance, just a chance, that they could find shelter, a place to hide. The mother's breathing was ragged. She was weak. The child in her arms barely moved. If they stayed, they were dead. Another growl, closer this time. Jared didn't hesitate. He reached down and grabbed the mother's arm, pulling her to her feet. She stumbled, her legs almost giving out beneath her, but she didn't resist. She understood now. They had no choice. Jared threw his pack over his shoulder and gripped his rifle, leading the way out of the wreck. The mother followed, her steps unsteady but determined. The child's head lolled against her shoulder, too weak to react. Jared didn't like how quiet the kid was. Starvation, dehydration. He didn't know. He just knew they had to move. The ruins ahead were their only hope. They were jagged, half-collapsed structures from an old war, with crumbling walls and twisted metal beams jutting out like broken bones. If they could reach them, they might have a chance to hide, to find cover long enough to come up with a real plan. Jared took point, scanning the shadows as they moved. The mother stayed close behind him, her breathing fast and uneven. Every few steps, she looked over her shoulder. She knew they were being followed. The ground beneath them was uneven, littered with debris. Jared moved quickly but carefully, leading them between the rusted remains of old vehicles and broken structures. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to see, but he could hear it now. Footsteps. Heavy. Slow. The predator was tracking them, taking its time. Then a sound that made Jared's blood run cold. A deep, snarling breath, right behind them. He spun, raising his rifle. The mother gasped, stepping back as a pair of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness. The creature was massive, its body covered in thick, matted fur, but its limbs were long and muscular, built for running. Its jaw was too wide, filled with jagged teeth, and its nostrils flared as it took in their scent. It had been toying with them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jared didn't give it the chance. He fired. The shot echoed through the ruins, the muzzle flash illuminating the night for a split second. The creature recoiled, snarling in pain as the bullet struck its shoulder. But it didn't go down. It didn't even slow. Jared fired again, aiming for the head this time, but the beast lunged just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, ricocheting off a rusted metal beam. Jared barely had time to move before the creature swiped at him, claws raking through the air where he had just been standing. He staggered back, heart hammering. It was too fast, too strong. If he stayed and fought, he'd be torn apart. The mother clutched her child and stared at the beast with wide, terrified eyes. She didn't run. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she knew that running would only make them easier prey. Jared cursed under his breath. He had one chance. He turned to the mother and motioned for her to move. She hesitated. He grabbed her arm again and pointed toward the ruins. "Go." Understanding flashed in her eyes. She turned and ran, cradling the child against her chest. The creature snarled, its gaze snapping to her retreating form. Jared knew what it was thinking. The weakest prey. The easy target. He couldn't let that happen. Jared fired again, this time aiming for its legs. The bullet hit home, and the beast let out a roar of pain, stumbling slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jared turned and sprinted after the mother. They ran through the ruins, their footsteps echoing against the broken walls. The mother was slowing down, her breaths ragged. Jared could hear the creature behind them, regaining its footing. It was coming. Up ahead, he spotted a collapsed structure with a narrow opening at its base, a tight space, too small for the creature to fit through. "This way," he shouted, motioning for her to follow. She hesitated for only a second before diving toward the opening. She slid inside, her body barely fitting through the gap. Jared followed, his heart pounding as he squeezed through the rubble. Behind him, the beast skidded to a halt, slamming its massive body against the wall, snarling in frustration. Jared collapsed against the cold stone, breathing hard. They had made it. But they weren't safe yet. The ruins were dark, unfamiliar. And outside, the predator wasn't giving up. Jared looked at the mother. She was curled up in the corner, rocking her child gently, whispering something he couldn't understand. They had escaped. For now. But if they wanted to survive the night, they needed a real plan. And fast. Jared pressed his back against the cold, crumbling wall of the ruin, his chest heaving as he tried to slow his breathing. Dust settled around him, disturbed by their desperate escape. His rifle was still clutched in his hands, barrel smoking slightly from the last shot. Beside him, the alien mother was hunched over, arms wrapped tightly around the child, as if shielding it from the world itself. Outside, the creature snarled, pacing. It hadn't left. It knew they were trapped. Jared wiped the sweat from his brow, forcing himself to focus. The structure they had taken refuge in was barely standing. The walls, though thick, had cracks wide enough to let in slivers of moonlight. The floor was uneven, a mix of broken stone and rusted metal, remnants of a battle long forgotten. Somewhere in the distance, the wind howled through shattered beams, creating an eerie, hollow whistle. The mother coughed weakly, still rocking the child in her arms. The kid wasn't making a sound. Not a single cry, not a single whimper. That wasn't a good sign. Jared glanced at the entrance they had squeezed through. The beast outside growled low, testing the gaps with its claws, scraping against the stone. It was waiting, biding its time. It knew hunger better than they did. It had patience. Jared didn't. He turned to the mother, crouching down to her level. "We can't stay here," he murmured, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. "It's going to find another way in." She just stared at him, her dark eyes filled with exhaustion and weariness. He wasn't sure if she even had the strength to run anymore. Her body trembled, her hands gripping the child as if sheer willpower alone would keep them alive. Jared sighed and ran a hand through his dust-caked hair. His options were running thin. He needed a plan. He scanned the ruin in the dim light, searching for anything useful. The remains of old machinery lay scattered around, their purposes long forgotten. A rusted console, shattered pieces of armor, a broken-down generator. The only thing that caught his attention was a metal grate, barely visible beneath layers of dirt. Jared crawled forward, brushing debris aside. The grate was heavy, but when he pressed against it, it shifted slightly. A passage. An old ventilation shaft, maybe. If it led somewhere, anywhere, other than this dead end, it could be their way out. The beast outside let out a loud guttural snarl. Jared stiffened. It wasn't waiting anymore. There was a thunderous crash as something massive slammed against the ruin's outer wall. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling. Jared didn't need to look to know what was happening. The creature was trying to break through. He turned back to the mother and motioned toward the grate. "Come on," he urged. "This is the only way." She hesitated, glancing toward the blocked entrance, then back at him. He could see the fear in her eyes. Crawling into a dark, unknown tunnel wasn't exactly an easy choice, but when another impact sent cracks racing through the stone, she had no choice. Jared yanked the grate loose, coughing as dust billowed out. The tunnel beneath was narrow, barely wide enough for them to crawl through, but it stretched far beyond his line of sight. He swallowed down his own unease. There wasn't time to second-guess. He gestured for her to go first. "I'll cover you." She hesitated again, then clutched her child tighter and lowered herself into the passage. Jared watched as she slid inside, her thin form disappearing into the shadows. The kid's tiny hands gripped her tattered clothing, unmoving. Jared gave one last look toward the crumbling entrance, then he followed. The moment he was inside, he pulled the grate back over the hole. Not perfect, but enough to buy them time. The tunnel was claustrophobic, filled with stale air that smelled of rust and damp earth. Jared moved on his elbows, crawling forward in the darkness. He could hear the mother ahead of him, her breathing shallow, her movements slow. Then, behind him, a sound that made his heart stop. The ruin collapsed. The creature had broken through. Jared flinched as a deafening crash filled the tunnel, sending a shockwave of dust and debris rushing through the passage. He didn't dare look back. He could feel the heat of displaced air, hear the creature's enraged snarl. They had seconds. "Move," he barked. The mother whimpered but pushed forward, dragging herself through the tunnel. Jared followed, moving as fast as he could in the tight space. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against his ribs, against his skull. His fingers scraped against rough metal. His lungs burned from the dust. Then, light. A faint, distant glow ahead. Jared pushed harder, his muscles screaming in protest. He reached the end of the tunnel just as the mother crawled out, gasping for air. They had made it. But as Jared pulled himself free, his relief was short-lived, because where they had emerged was not safe. They were standing at the edge of a deep, open chasm. The land ahead had been torn apart, the ground fractured and unstable. Giant metal beams jutted from the darkness below like skeletal remains of a forgotten war. The ground beneath their feet was barely holding together. Jared barely had time to register the danger before the mother stumbled, nearly losing her footing. He lunged, grabbing her arm, steadying her. A growl echoed from the tunnel behind them. Jared turned just in time to see the creature forcing itself inside. It was too big. The tunnel was too narrow. But it was coming anyway. Bones cracked. Flesh tore. The creature snarled in pain as it squeezed through the impossible gap, its hunger overriding all sense of self-preservation. Jared didn't wait. He grabbed the mother's wrist and ran. The ground beneath them shook. The chasm yawned before them, but there, a rusted bridge, barely holding together, stretching across the abyss. It was old, unstable, but it was their only shot. Jared didn't slow down. Behind them, the creature burst free from the tunnel, bloodied and furious, and it was right on their heels. Jared's boots slammed against the cracked, rusted bridge as he ran, dragging the alien mother with him. Every step sent a groaning creak through the ancient metal, the entire structure trembling under their weight. The chasm beneath them stretched into endless darkness, a pit so deep that even the pale glow of the distant stars failed to reach its bottom. The beast was right behind them. It emerged from the tunnel with a furious roar, its massive frame squeezing through the jagged hole they had crawled through. Blood seeped from deep cuts along its hide where the metal had torn at its flesh, but it didn't care. Hunger burned in its glowing eyes. Its claws scraped against the ground, tearing up chunks of stone as it lunged forward. Jared's lungs burned as he ran, his grip tightening around the alien woman's wrist. She was struggling to keep up, her body weak and battered, but she forced herself forward. The child in her arms barely stirred. Jared could see it in her eyes. She wasn't running for herself. She was running for that kid. A loud crack echoed through the air. Jared felt the vibration beneath his feet an instant before he saw it. The bridge was breaking. One of the rusted support beams gave out, and a large section of metal plating collapsed into the abyss. Jared barely managed to skid to a stop before he ran straight off the edge. His breath caught in his throat as he looked down. A gaping hole stretched across the bridge, too wide to jump. He turned, heart pounding. The beast had slowed its pace, sensing the instability of the structure, but it was still advancing. It was playing a sick game now, stalking them. It knew they were trapped. Jared scanned his surroundings, his mind racing. There had to be another way. A path, a ladder, something. Then he saw it. A rusted maintenance ladder leading up the side of a crumbling tower at the edge of the chasm. It was their only chance. He turned to the mother and pointed. There. Climb. She hesitated only for a second, her gaze flicking toward the monster behind them. Understanding flashed in her tired eyes. She adjusted her grip on the child and sprinted toward the ladder, grabbing the lowest rung and hoisting herself up. Jared turned back toward the beast. It was closer now, its breath steaming in the cold air. He gritted his teeth. If he climbed up now, the thing would just wait below, or worse, try to pull them down. He had to give them time. He raised his rifle. The creature snarled, its muscles coiling, preparing to lunge. Jared fired. The shot hit its mark, striking the beast's leg. The creature roared in fury, stumbling slightly, but it didn't stop. It pushed forward, its weight shaking the bridge even more. Jared fired again, this time aiming for its face. But the moment he pulled the trigger, click. Empty. His stomach dropped. No time to reload. The beast lunged. Jared dove to the side, rolling across the rusted bridge as massive claws slashed through the air where he had just been. The creature's momentum carried it forward. And that was when the bridge gave way. With a deafening crack, the rusted metal split apart beneath the monster's weight. The beast let out a shocked, guttural roar as the section of the bridge collapsed, sending it tumbling into the abyss. Jared barely managed to grab onto a piece of intact metal as the ground beneath him crumbled. His fingers scraped against rust, barely finding purchase. He dangled for a moment, legs swinging over nothingness, before he forced himself up, using every ounce of strength to pull himself onto solid ground. Gasping for breath, he turned his head just in time to see the last traces of the monster disappear into the dark void below. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the faint sound of claws scraping against stone. Jared's blood ran cold. It wasn't dead. Somewhere, far below, it was still moving. He didn't wait to find out how long it would take to climb back up. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted toward the ladder, jumping onto the lowest rung and pulling himself up. The mother was already near the top, struggling but determined. The child was still silent, limp against her chest. Jared could hear her breathing, shallow and quick, as she climbed higher and higher. The tower they were climbing had once been part of an industrial complex, its structure made of thick steel beams and reinforced concrete. Most of it had crumbled away, leaving only skeletal remains. The ladder rattled under their combined weight, but it held. Jared climbed as fast as he could, his arms burning from exertion. Finally, he reached the top. They had emerged onto a platform, an old maintenance deck, long abandoned. It stretched along the side of the tower, leading to what looked like a control room at the far end. The alien mother collapsed onto the metal floor, cradling the child close, whispering something in a language Jared didn't understand. Jared took a deep breath, scanning their surroundings. The deck was narrow, but it was high. No way the creature could reach them now, not without finding another way up. His relief was short-lived. A sound crackled through the air, A radio transmission. Jared's head snapped toward the control room door. The sound was faint, garbled, but unmistakable. A signal. A human signal. Someone was here. He turned to the mother. She was barely conscious, holding onto the child as if letting go would mean death. They were exhausted, starving. They wouldn't last much longer. Jared clenched his fists. He didn't know who was inside that control room, but he had to find out. Because right now, the only thing standing between them and death was whoever was on the other side of that door. Jared took a slow, steady breath, his pulse still hammering in his ears. The radio crackled again, the static cutting through the heavy silence of the abandoned maintenance deck. His gaze flickered to the alien mother, curled against the cold metal floor, her arms wrapped protectively around the child. She was breathing, but barely. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her strength spent. She wouldn't last much longer. Neither would the kid. Jared turned back toward the rusted control room door. Someone was inside. Someone human. He tightened his grip on his rifle, now empty, nothing but a useless hunk of metal in his hands. He didn't know who was in there, or if they'd be friendly, but he didn't have a choice. He had to take the risk. Steeling himself, he stepped forward and knocked hard on the metal door. For a long moment, nothing. Then the sound of movement. Quick, sharp, the unmistakable scrape of a chair being shoved back. A second later, a voice. Gruff, wary. "Who the hell is out there?" Jared exhaled sharply. He hadn't heard another human voice in weeks. He kept his tone steady, calm. "Name's Jared. I don't want trouble. Just looking for shelter." Silence. Then, "You alone?" Jared hesitated. He glanced over his shoulder at the mother and child. This was the moment. He could lie, pretend he was alone, maybe increase his chances of getting inside. But his gut twisted at the thought. He had come this far. He wasn't about to abandon them now. "I've got two with me," he said finally. "A woman and a kid." The pause was longer this time. Jared could hear the faint clicking of buttons, the shuffling of boots. The person inside was thinking, deciding. Then, a loud metallic clang as the locks disengage. The door creaked open just a sliver, revealing a sliver of a face, a weathered, scarred man with tired eyes and an old rifle in his hands. He squinted at Jared, then past him, his gaze landing on the alien mother. His expression darkened instantly. "Aliens." His voice was sharp, edged with something bitter. "You brought them here." Jared felt his muscles tense. "They need help." The man let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Help? You think we're in any position to be helping their kind?" He motioned toward the wasteland beyond the chasm. "You see what's left of this planet. You know who did this." His jaw clenched. "Them." Jared exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had seen this kind of hatred before. Soldiers who had lost everything in the war. Survivors who blamed all aliens for the destruction, regardless of who they were. He stepped forward slightly, lowering his voice. "She's got a kid," he said, his tone firm but quiet. "They're starving. She's barely holding on." The man's grip tightened on his rifle. For a second, Jared thought he was going to slam the door in his face. But then, something flickered in the man's expression. Hesitation. Uncertainty. Then, finally, with a frustrated growl, he stepped back and opened the door wider. Inside. Now. Jared wasted no time. He turned and hurried back to the mother, crouching down beside her. She flinched at his touch, still weak, still wary, but she didn't resist as he helped her to her feet. The child barely moved in her arms, their small, fragile body limp against her chest. Jared half-carried her inside, past the old soldier, past the flickering emergency lights, into the dim, cramped shelter beyond. The door slammed shut behind them, the locks engaging once more. The room was small, cluttered with old equipment and scavenged supplies. A makeshift cot sat in the corner, along with a half-eaten meal on a rusted metal table. It smelled of oil and dust, of old circuits and stale air, but it was safe, at least for now. The soldier, who still hadn't given his name, moved to a nearby crate, grabbing a canteen and tossing it toward Jared. "Water," he grunted. "Give it to her." Jared didn't waste time. He knelt beside the mother and held the canteen to her lips. She hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the soldier, but thirst overpowered fear. She took a slow sip, then another, before carefully pressing the canteen to the child's lips. The kid stirred slightly, weak but alive. Jared exhaled in relief. They weren't dead yet. The soldier watched in silence, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes remained cold. After a long moment, he spoke. "They're not staying," he said flatly. Jared stiffened. "They can barely stand. You want me to throw them out there with that thing still crawling around?" The soldier shook his head. "I don't give a damn about the thing. What I care about is keeping my own ass alive. And bringing them in here." He jabbed a finger toward the mother. "That's a liability. What if she's sending out signals? What if there are more of her kind coming?" His voice lowered. "What if they're not as helpless as they look?" Jared's jaw clenched. He knew this argument. He had fought in the war, had seen both sides, humans and aliens, commit atrocities. He had also seen the innocent get caught in the crossfire. "These two aren't your enemy," he said quietly. "They're just trying to survive." The soldier scoffed. "Yeah? And what happens when you wake up with a knife in your back?" Jared's patience snapped. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't know me," he said, voice tight. "You don't know them. But I know one thing. If you throw them out there, you're no better than the monsters that did this." The soldier tensed. For a second, Jared thought he was going to reach for his gun. But instead, the man let out a slow, tired breath and ran a hand over his face. "One night," he muttered finally. "They stay for one night. And if I even think they're a threat, they're gone. Understand?" Jared nodded. "Understood." The soldier shook his head, muttering under his breath as he moved toward the cot, grabbing an old blanket and tossing it toward the mother. She flinched but caught it, hesitating before wrapping it around herself and the child. Jared crouched beside her, his voice soft. "You're safe. For now." She didn't understand his words, but she understood the way his voice softened, the way his shoulders relaxed, just a little. She nodded. Jared leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. Outside, the wasteland stretched on, empty and unforgiving. Somewhere far below, the creature still lurked, waiting. But for the first time since this nightmare had started, they had a chance. Jared took a slow, steady breath, his pulse still hammering in his ears. The radio crackled again, the static cutting through the heavy silence of the abandoned maintenance deck. His gaze flickered to the alien mother, curled against the cold metal floor, her arms wrapped protectively around the child. She was breathing, but barely. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her strength spent. She wouldn't last much longer. Neither would the kid. Jared turned back toward the rusted control room door. Someone was inside. Someone human. He tightened his grip on his rifle, now empty, nothing but a useless hunk of metal in his hands. He didn't know who was in there, or if they'd be friendly, but he didn't have a choice. He had to take the risk. Steeling himself, he stepped forward and knocked hard on the metal door. For a long moment, nothing. Then the sound of movement, quick, sharp, the unmistakable scrape of a chair being shoved back. A second later, a voice, gruff, wary. "Who the hell is out there?" Jared exhaled sharply. He hadn't heard another human voice in weeks. He kept his tone steady, calm. "Name's Jared. I don't want trouble. Just looking for shelter." Silence. Then, "You alone?" Jared hesitated. He glanced over his shoulder at the mother and child. This was the moment. He could lie. Pretend he was alone. Maybe increase his chances of getting inside. but his gut twisted at the thought. He had come this far. He wasn't about to abandon them now. "I've got two with me," he said finally. "A woman and a kid." The pause was longer this time. Jared could hear the faint clicking of buttons, the shuffling of boots. The person inside was thinking, deciding. Then, a loud metallic clang as the locks disengage. The door creaked open just a sliver, revealing a sliver of a face, a weathered, scarred man with tired eyes and an old rifle in his hands. He squinted at Jared, then past him, his gaze landing on the alien mother. His expression darkened instantly. "Aliens?" His voice was sharp, edged with something bitter. "You brought them here." Jared felt his muscles tense. "They need help." The man let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Help? You think we're in any position to be helping their kind?" He motioned toward the wasteland beyond the chasm. "You see what's left of this planet. You know who did this." His jaw clenched. "Them." Jared exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had seen this kind of hatred before. Soldiers who had lost everything in the war, survivors who blamed all aliens for the destruction, regardless of who they were. He stepped forward slightly, lowering his voice. "She's got a kid," he said, his tone firm but quiet. "They're starving. She's barely holding on." The man's grip tightened on his rifle. For a second, Jared thought he was going to slam the door in his face. But then something flickered in the man's expression. Hesitation. Uncertainty. Then, finally, with a frustrated growl, he stepped back and opened the door wider. Inside. Now, Jared wasted no time. He turned and hurried back to the mother, crouching down beside her. She flinched at his touch, still weak, still wary, but she didn't resist as he helped her to her feet. The child barely moved in her arms, their small, fragile body limp against her chest. Jared half-carried her inside, past the old soldier, past the flickering emergency lights, into the dim, cramped shelter beyond. The door slammed shut behind them, the locks engaging once more. The room was small, cluttered with old equipment and scavenged supplies. A makeshift cot sat in the corner, along with a half-eaten meal on a rusted metal table. It smelled of oil and dust, of old circuits and stale air, but it was safe. At least for now. The soldier, who still hadn't given his name, moved to a nearby crate, grabbing a canteen and tossing it toward Jared. "Water," he grunted. "Give it to her." Jared didn't waste time. He knelt beside the mother and held the canteen to her lips. She hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the soldier, but thirst overpowered fear. She took a slow sip, then another, before carefully pressing the canteen to the child's lips. The kid stirred slightly, weak but alive. Jared exhaled in relief. They weren't dead yet. The soldier watched in silence, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes remained cold. After a long moment, he spoke. "They're not staying," he said flatly. Jared stiffened. "They can barely stand. You want me to throw them out there with that thing still crawling around?" The soldier shook his head. "I don't give a damn about the thing. What I care about is keeping my own ass alive. And bringing them in here." He jabbed a finger toward the mother. "That's a liability. What if she's sending out signals? What if there are more of her kind coming?" His voice lowered. "What if they're not as helpless as they look?" Jared's jaw clenched. He knew this argument. He had fought in the war, had seen both sides, humans and aliens, commit atrocities. He had also seen the innocent get caught in the crossfire. "These two aren't your enemy," he said quietly. "They're just trying to survive." The soldier scoffed. "Yeah? And what happens when you wake up with a knife in your back?" Jared's patience snapped. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't know me," he said, voice tight. "You don't know them. But I know one thing. If you throw them out there, you're no better than the monsters that did this." The soldier tensed. For a second, Jared thought he was going to reach for his gun. But instead, The man let out a slow, tired breath and ran a hand over his face. "One night," he muttered finally. "They stay for one night. And if I even think they're a threat, they're gone. Understand?" Jared nodded. "Understood." The soldier shook his head, muttering under his breath as he moved toward the cot, grabbing an old blanket and tossing it toward the mother. She flinched but caught it, hesitating before wrapping it around herself and the child. Jared crouched beside her, his voice soft. "You're safe. For now." She didn't understand his words, but she understood the way his voice softened, the way his shoulders relaxed, just a little. She nodded. Jared leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. Outside, the wasteland stretched on, empty and unforgiving. Somewhere far below, the creature still lurked, waiting. But for the first time since this nightmare had started, they had a chance. Jared sat against the cold metal wall of the shelter, his rifle resting across his lap, empty but still a comforting weight in his hands. The alien mother lay curled in the corner, the child tucked against her chest, wrapped in the threadbare blanket. She had barely moved since drinking the water, her body exhausted, her limbs trembling even in sleep. The child, too, was eerily still, their frail body rising and falling with shallow breaths. The old soldier, still unnamed, sat across from Jared at the rusted table, watching him with a look that was equal parts exhaustion and distrust. Between them sat an open ration pack, its contents mostly gone, a few crumbs scattered across the surface. "She doesn't talk," the soldier finally muttered. "Or she's choosing not to." Jared glanced at the mother. Her breathing was steady now, deeper, but her face remained tense, even in sleep. She wasn't at peace. She wasn't safe enough to be. "She doesn't speak our language," Jared replied. "That, or she's too weak to try." The soldier scoffed. "Convenient." He leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. His face was lined with old scars, his eyes tired but sharp. A man who had seen too much, lost too much. Jared didn't take the bait. He'd had this conversation before, in too many war zones, with too many men who sought everything in black and white. "She's not a threat." "You don't know that." "I know enough." The soldier leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What you know is nothing. You don't know who she is, where she came from, or why the hell she's here. You don't know if she's the only one. You don't even know if that kid's hers." His gaze flickered toward the sleeping child. "And that thing doesn't look like her." "Not exactly." Jared stiffened. He hadn't thought much about it, not with all the running, the surviving. But now, as he looked closer, he saw what the soldier meant. The mother's skin was a deep shade of blue, marred by bruises and exhaustion, her facial features smooth and angular. The child, however, was different, lighter in color, softer, with rounder eyes that seemed almost human. Jared frowned. "So what?" The soldier shook his head, exhaling through his nose. "You ever hear the stories about what they did to prisoners? About the experiments?" He leaned in. "Maybe she isn't the kid's mother. Maybe she's something worse." Jared's grip tightened around his rifle. Enough. But the doubt had already planted itself in his mind. Before he could dwell on it, the radio crackled again. The soldier cursed under his breath and reached for it, adjusting the frequency dial. Static hummed through the shelter, broken only by a garbled voice, distorted but undeniably human. Jared sat up straighter. "This is Outpost 7. Kish. Requesting. Kish. Evac. Hostile presence. Kish. Repeat. We need evac." Jared's heart pounded. That signal was close. Someone else was out there. The soldier's expression darkened. Outpost 7 was wiped out a month ago. Jared narrowed his eyes. Then who the hell is sending that signal? Another burst of static. Then, survivors detected, unknown life signatures. Assistance en route. Jared froze. That wasn't human. The soldier slammed his fist against the table, standing so fast his chair scraped against the floor. They called in backup. I told you she was dangerous. Jared turned to the mother, but she was already awake, her eyes wide with fear. She knew what that signal meant. And then, outside the shelter, the night came alive. A deep, thrumming sound vibrated through the air, distant but growing closer. Jared had heard enough dropships in his life to recognize the hum of approaching engines. The mother clutched the child tighter, her body trembling. Her eyes flicked to Jared, pleading, desperate. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't relieved. She was terrified. Jared stood, instincts screaming at him. This wasn't a rescue. This was something else. The soldier grabbed his rifle. I'm not waiting to see who they are. He turned toward the shelter door, unlocking the heavy latch. You can stay here and die with them, or you can help me get the hell out of here. Jared clenched his jaw. You don't know what's coming. I don't need to. He motioned toward the mother. And I sure as hell am not dying for them. Jared looked back at the woman. Her breathing was fast, uneven. She knew what was coming. She had sent out the signal, but not for herself. She had done it for the child. Jared exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dust-caked hair. You want to run. He turned back to the soldier. Go, but I'm not leaving them. The soldier let out a bitter laugh. You're gonna die for an alien. Jared met his gaze. I fought in the war. I killed aliens before. Good ones, bad ones. I learned the difference. His voice hardened. I know which one she is. The soldier stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. You're a damn fool. He swung the door open and stepped outside, vanishing into the ruins. Jared turned back to the mother. We need to move. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the urgency. She struggled to her feet, gripping the child tightly. Outside, the thrumming grew louder. Jared grabbed his pack and threw it over his shoulder. He didn't know who was coming. He didn't know if they were friendly, or if they would be worse than the beast still lurking in the chasm below. But he knew one thing. The moment that ship landed, everything would change. Jared tightened the straps of his pack, his mind racing. The distant thrumming of approaching engines sent vibrations through the air, rattling loose debris inside the ruined shelter. The alien mother clutched the child close, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts, her wide eyes fixed on the sky beyond the broken walls. She knew what was coming, and she was afraid. Jared had seen this kind of fear before, on battlefields, in war zones, in the eyes of civilians who knew they were caught in a conflict far beyond their control. This wasn't just fear of the unknown. This was fear of something she had already seen before. He moved quickly, grabbing whatever supplies he could. Water, spare ammunition, though his rifle was still empty, and an old combat knife. His gut told him this wasn't a rescue. It was a hunt. Outside, the night sky burned with streaks of light as the ship descended. The engines howled, sending clouds of dust and ash spiraling into the air. Jared shielded his eyes as the glare from the landing thrusters lit up the ruins. The mother pressed herself into the shadows, shielding the child beneath the folds of the tattered blanket. She whispered something in her own language, barely audible over the roar of the descending craft. The child stirred but did not cry. They were too weak. Jared crouched beside her, his voice low, firm. We have to move. Now. She didn't need to understand his words to know what he meant. She nodded, tightening her grip on the child, and followed him toward the exit. As they reached the doorway, a loud metallic clang echoed through the air as the ship's landing gear made contact with the scorched ground. The engines powered down, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Then, with a hiss, the ship's ramp began to lower. Jared stopped, pulling the mother behind a section of crumbling wall. His heart pounded as he waited, watching, listening. The first figure stepped onto the ramp, moving with slow, deliberate precision. The armor was sleek, dark, and unlike anything Jared had seen before. Not human. More figures followed, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with purpose. Their helmets obscured their faces, but their weapons were unmistakable, sleek, high-powered rifles with energy cores that pulsed like veins beneath the surface. This was not a rescue team. Jared swore under his breath. The lead figure raised a device to its helmet, speaking in a low guttural tone. A distorted voice echoed through the ship's external comms. Target acquired. Begin extraction. Jared's grip tightened around the knife in his hand. They weren't here for all of them. They were here for the child. The mother must have realized it too, because she let out a soft, strangled sound. Half a sob, half a plea. Her entire body trembled as she backed away, holding the child even closer, as if she could will them to disappear. Jared had a choice. He could run. He could leave them. Or he could fight. He exhaled sharply, turning to the mother. "Stay here," he whispered. She didn't understand, but his tone said enough. He grabbed a chunk of broken concrete and hurled it toward the far side of the ruins. The rock clattered against the debris, loud enough to echo through the open space. The armored figures turned in unison, their weapons snapping into position. One of them barked something in their own language. Then, they moved. Jared didn't wait. He grabbed the mother's arm and pulled her into the ruins, darting between broken beams and rusted machinery. He could feel her shaking under his grip, but she didn't resist. She ran. Behind them, a burst of gunfire. The energy blast struck the ground, sending up sparks and chunks of metal. Jared swore as they ducked behind cover. One of the figures called out again, this time in a voice that was almost human. "Give us the child, and you will be spared." Jared clenched his jaw. They didn't care about the mother. They didn't care about him. They only wanted the kid. The mother was breathing fast, wild panic in her eyes. She understood now, understood that they were here for her child. Jared turned, meeting her gaze. She was asking him a question without speaking. Would he protect them? Would he fight for them? He gave a single nod. The mother's expression shifted, her fear hardening into determination. Then she did something Jared didn't expect. She reached into the folds of her clothing and pulled out a small circular device, something metallic, something old. She pressed her fingers against its surface, and it flickered to life, humming softly. A distress beacon, but not just any distress beacon. A warning signal. Jared barely had time to react before a new sound filled the air. A second ship. It came fast, roaring through the sky, its dark hull gleaming under the moonlight. The pursuing soldiers hesitated, their weapons lifting toward the incoming vessel. Jared grabbed the mother's hand. Now. They ran. The new ship descended with incredible speed, its thrusters kicking up a storm of dust and debris. The hatch opened before it had even fully landed, revealing a silhouette. Another alien. But this one wasn't armed with rifles. This one wore armor designed for war. The soldiers in pursuit hesitated. A single voice echoed from the ship's loudspeaker, deep and commanding. "Step away from the child." Jared barely understood what happened next. The mother moved. She wasn't weak. She wasn't helpless. She had been waiting. With the speed of a trained warrior, she lunged forward, grabbing one of the stunned soldiers by the arm and twisting. There was a sickening crack as the alien soldier collapsed. Jared didn't waste time watching. He grabbed the child from the ground, holding them close as the mother fought. She was faster than she should have been. Stronger. The new arrivals wasted no time. The armored alien leaped from the ship, weapons drawn, and the battle began. Jared ran. He ducked past broken beams, dodging stray blasts as the firefight exploded around him. The mother stayed close, her breath ragged but steady. The child stirred against Jared's chest. He looked down and met wide, human eyes. His stomach dropped. The kid wasn't just alien. They were part human. Jared's mind reeled, but he couldn't stop now. He sprinted toward the open hatch of the waiting ship, feeling the heat of gunfire at his back. Then, hands grabbing him, pulling him inside. The mother leaped in after him. The ramp sealed shut. The ship lifted off. Jared collapsed against the wall, breathing hard, his heart hammering in his chest. The mother was beside him, still clutching the child, but her body was shaking, not from fear, but relief. She looked at Jared, truly looked at him. Then she bowed. Jared exhaled, closing his eyes. Everything had changed. And somehow he knew this was only the beginning.